On November 19, 1961, a 23-year-old man tied 2 empty fuel cans to his waist, looked at the person next to him, and said something that would become one of the most haunting lines in the history of unexplained disappearances. He said, "I think I can make it." Then he slipped into the water of a river mouth on the southern coast of New Guinea and started swimming toward land, alone. He was never seen again. His name was Michael Rockefeller, and the reason his disappearance became a worldwide sensation wasn't just the mystery of what happened to him in the water. It was who he was. Michael was the son of Nelson Rockefeller, the governor of New York, and one of the most powerful political figures in America, and a member of one of the wealthiest families the country had ever produced. When news broke that a Rockefeller heir had vanished somewhere in the jungles of New Guinea, it triggered one of the largest and most expensive search operations in history, involving military aircraft, ships, and even his own father flying halfway across the world to personally search the coastline. And despite all of that money, all of that power, all of that desperate effort, nobody ever found him. Not his body, not his belongings, nothing conclusive at all. To understand why Michael Rockefeller was even in New Guinea in the first place, you have to understand what had completely consumed his attention in the final months of his life. He wasn't there by accident, and he wasn't there for leisure. He was there because he had become fascinated, almost obsessively, with the art of a tribe called the Asmat, an indigenous group living in one of the most remote and inaccessible regions on the planet, deep in the swamps and river systems of what was then Dutch New Guinea. The Asmat were master woodcarvers. Their art wasn't decorative in the way most Western collectors thought about art. It was deeply spiritual, tied directly to their beliefs about death, ancestry, and the balance between the living and the dead. They carved enormous ceremonial poles called bishi poles, towering totems covered in interlocking human and animal figures, created specifically to honor deceased relatives, and according to Asmat tradition, to spur the living toward taking revenge for deaths that had gone unavenged. This wasn't art created for a gallery wall. It was art created as part of an active, ongoing spiritual and social system, one that Western museums and collectors were only just beginning to take seriously as an art form worth preserving. Michael, along with a Dutch anthropologist named René Wassing, had traveled to the Asmat region specifically to collect these carvings for a museum exhibition his father was helping fund back in New York. This wasn't Michael's first trip either. He had been there before, spent months studying the culture, building relationships, and buying pieces directly from Asmat carvers and villages. He wasn't a tourist wandering into danger. He was, by most accounts, one of the more knowledgeable Western visitors the region had seen, someone who understood at least some of what he was dealing with, which makes what happened next even harder to fully explain. On the morning of November 18th, Michael and René set out in a small catamaran-style boat, made of 2 dugout canoes lashed together with a simple platform on top, heading across open water toward another Asmat village. The boat wasn't built for the conditions they encountered. Partway through the crossing, the sea turned rough. Waves began crashing over the sides, and the small vessel eventually capsized completely, leaving both men stranded, clinging to the overturned hull, with no engine, no radio, and no way to call for help. For hours, they drifted. The current pulled them further from shore, rather than closer to it. As night fell and turned into the next day, it became clear that nobody was coming, and that the boat itself wasn't going to get them anywhere. It was at this point, roughly 12 to 14 hours after the capsizing, that Michael made the decision that would define the rest of his life, or rather, the complete absence of the rest of his life. He believed he could see land in the distance. He believed it was close enough to swim, and with 2 empty fuel cans as makeshift flotation devices tied around his waist, he told René he was going to try to make it to shore, and that he'd send help back for him. René Wassing stayed with the boat and was rescued roughly a day later, alive, exhausted, but alive. Michael Rockefeller was never seen again by anyone who could confirm it with certainty. The official explanation, the one accepted by most historians, and the one the Dutch and American governments ultimately settled on, is straightforward and, frankly, plausible on its own. The waters off that stretch of New Guinea coast are known to contain large saltwater crocodiles, among the most dangerous predators on the planet, along with strong, unpredictable currents capable of exhausting even a strong swimmer over a distance of several miles. Under this explanation, Michael simply never made it. He drowned from exhaustion or was killed by a crocodile somewhere in that long, desperate swim, and his remains were either consumed, swept out to sea, or lost in the mangrove swamps that line much of that coastline. It's not a dramatic or conspiratorial explanation. It's tragically mundane, and it fits everything we know about the physical dangers of that specific environment. But it's not the only theory, and the other one is significantly darker. Some of the Asmat villages in that exact region had a documented history, confirmed by colonial administrators and missionaries at the time, of ritual practices tied to what was known as headhunting, and in certain contexts, ritual cannibalism connected to their spiritual belief system around death and revenge. This wasn't secret or speculative information even in 1961. Dutch colonial authorities were actively working to suppress these practices in the years surrounding Michael's disappearance, and there had been documented incidents of violence between Asmat villages and outside visitors, including a violent clash just a few years earlier involving a Dutch patrol officer that resulted in deaths on both sides, an event some believe was still fueling unresolved tension and a cycle of revenge obligations in the area precisely during the period Michael went missing. For decades, this theory remained largely speculative, whispered about but never confirmed, treated by most media outlets as too sensitive or too unverifiable to pursue seriously. Michael's own family, the Rockefellers, publicly maintained the drowning explanation and, by most accounts, genuinely believed it, or at least chose to accept it as the only version of events they could bear to live with. Then, decades later, journalists and researchers began doing something nobody had seriously attempted before. They went back to the Asmat region itself and started asking questions directly, in person, to the descendants of the people who had actually been there in 1961. What they found was unsettling. Multiple independent interviews, conducted separately by different investigators over the years, produced strikingly consistent accounts from elderly Asmat villagers who claimed to remember or to have been told directly by relatives who were present that a white man had in fact washed ashore alive in the exact region and time frame Michael disappeared. According to these accounts, he made it. He survived the swim that everyone assumed had killed him. What allegedly happened after that is where the accounts become almost unbearable to hear, and where journalistic caution has to take over from sensationalism. The versions collected suggest that the man who washed ashore was killed, and in keeping with the specific revenge-based ritual practices some Asmat groups still maintained around that time, was killed and consumed as part of an ongoing cycle of retaliation, connected to that earlier violent incident with Dutch colonial officers years before, one that some in the community reportedly felt had never been properly settled or avenged. None of these accounts have ever been definitively proven. There's no physical evidence, no forensic confirmation, nothing that would hold up as conclusive proof in a court of law or a museum exhibit. What exists is oral testimony, collected decades after the fact, from a community with its own complex relationship to outsiders, asking uncomfortable questions about a deeply painful and legally sensitive chapter of their own history. Some investigators who conducted these interviews came away convinced the accounts were credible and consistent enough to be taken seriously. Others, including some anthropologists familiar with Asmat oral tradition, caution that stories can shift, exaggerate, or become conflated with other events over 60 years of retelling, especially when outsiders arrive specifically looking for a dramatic answer. The Rockefeller family itself has never publicly endorsed this version of events. Nelson Rockefeller continued the search efforts for weeks after most experts believed there was no realistic chance of finding his son alive, funding an operation that, by some estimates, cost well over the equivalent of $1 million in today's money, using naval vessels, aircraft, and dozens of search personnel, combing a coastline of mangroves, rivers, and open water that made any thorough search almost impossible. Nothing conclusive was ever recovered. Not a body, not clothing confirmed to be his, not a single piece of physical evidence that could close the case one way or the other. What we're left with, more than 60 years later, is a case that occupies an unusual space, between two entirely plausible explanations, one mundane and tragic, one dark and almost unspeakable, with no definitive evidence pointing conclusively toward either one. A young man from one of the most powerful and protected families in American history swam into open water, believing he could reach safety, and simply ceased to exist as far as any verifiable record is concerned. Some of the art he collected during his final months in New Guinea still hangs today in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, in a wing named in his honor. Pieces of Asmat, spiritual and ceremonial tradition that Michael believed deserved to be preserved and understood by the wider world. It's a strange, almost poetic irony that the objects he risked and ultimately lost his life trying to bring back are the closest thing that remains of him at all, standing in a museum thousands of miles from the water where he disappeared, while the truth of what actually happened to him remains exactly where it's been for over 6 decades. Somewhere between the shore he was trying to reach and a story that nobody has ever been able to fully confirm or fully deny.